I'm Dexter Mossberg. Welcome to my Discovering Psychology project, The Bad Seed, Nature versus Nurture. So the center of my presentation is a film from 1956 called The Bad Seed, and it's about Rhoda Penmark, who is a superficially perfect little girl, very polite, very charming, but she's actually a sociopathic murderer, despite being raised in a loving and stable household. The film's explanation for this is that Rhoda's biological grandmother was a notorious serial killer sent to the electric chair, and that her sociopathy was passed down to Rhoda genetically. This film explicitly references the nature versus nurture dichotomy in psychology and comes down on the nature side of things because Rhoda's sociopathy is genetic and her drive to kill is ingrained. But what's the truth? Before getting into that, I want to play this compilation of film clips from the movie demonstrating Rhoda's sort of sociopathic persona, just so you have a better understanding of what I'm talking about.
We know a daddy who loves somebody, all right. What does the card say? For no reason.
There she is at a little table, playing with the little dishes, looking cute and innocent, looking like she wouldn't melt butter. She's that cool. Well, she can fool some people with that innocent look she can put on and put off whenever she wants to, but not me. Not even part way she can't fool me.
Please say you won't let them hurt me. You better give them back to me, Leroy. Right hand of me!
Isn't she a little sweetheart?
Thank you.
That's the kind of thing that makes an old bachelor wish he were married.
Oh, you like little girls?
Now, what do you give me if I give you a basket of kisses?
I'll give you a basket of hugs.
I'll miss your hugs.
Is it true that when blood has been washed off anything, a policeman can still find if it's there?
I won't let them hurt you. I don't know what must be done now, but I promise you nobody will hurt you. Rhoda, how did you get the medal?
Oh, I got it later on.
How?
Well, Claude went back to his promise, and I followed him.
So that last clip specifically is her confessing to murdering this boy Claude and stealing the medal from a penmanship contest that she lost to him. And it displays her ego and her sociopathic lack of remorse. Now, nature versus nurture is a long-standing debate in psychology over how people acquire important knowledge or traits. Are we born with it? Is it innate? Or are we born as a blank slate and everything we know, it's because we've learned it? This dichotomy goes all the way back to the roots of psychology. Ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle had different ideas about where people got their knowledge, and there are still research studies being done to this day exploring this debate. The Bad Seed uses it as the central drama in its plot, but for what reasons? This topic was of interest to me because as a film major, I wanted to explore how psychological concepts are used in movies and what that says about the culture that produced them. I think film and fiction in general is an incredibly powerful tool because not only does it create intentional meaning, it can capture unintentional meaning because we're all products of the culture we're raised in. And when we create, we sort of put our cultural baggage in there unintentionally, and it can capture subliminal ideas about certain things. And we sort of reproduce the attitudes of our times. The Bad Seed was one of the biggest hits for its studio in 1956, so I believe it must have struck a chord with its audience. As to why it struck a chord, we're going to have to look into the cultural context of the film, which is 1950s America. So, when talking about the public perception of nature versus nurture in 1950s America, we're specifically going to be looking at the issue of juvenile delinquency because that is the sort of cultural event that inspired the bad seed. Despite the common stereotype of 1950s America being idyllic and peaceful, there was a large cultural panic over juvenile delinquency, and it was plausible because one statistic states that juvenile arrests increased by 220% from 1941 to 1957. There were lots of high-profile cases, specifically set in schools where, like, I think a couple 14-year-olds set up a bomb on, like, a soccer field, and someone ended up dying, and, like, teenage gangs were started to be formed, and all of these crimes had one thing in common. They were all really violent. Homemade weapons and murder. And although the US goes through sort of flare-ups over youth crime, this one was very specifically about violent children. So we can already see the roots for the bad seed. However, one way that the bad seed and the overall response to juvenile delinquency in the US differs is that the culture at the time tended to blame environmental factors, which is leaning more towards nurture because the idea behind it was that consuming these bad pieces of media would give you the knowledge and the disposition to start committing violence, which is the opposite of the nature side of the coin. We see something similar in this in the 90s where people were blaming violent video games, but the media of choice in the 1950s was comic books. Many believed that the distinct culture that teenagers were developing was causing them to be morally degraded. And this also applies to rock and roll, but specifically in the juvenile delinquency and violence issue, it was superhero comics. There's this book, Seduction of the Innocent, written by psychiatrist Frederick Wertham, that was extremely popular in the US, and it warned of the highly corrosive nature of horror, crime, and superhero comics. Among his points, he does allege that Wonder Woman is a secret lesbian and Batman and Robin are gay, and that these are leading children astray from the typical family unit. And this sort of reflects, Freud's psychoanalysis with the theme of, sexual, like, hidden undertones. And that's because psychoanalysis was the school of psychology that was aggressing out of favor during the mid-1950s in favor of behaviorism. So in his book, we sort of see a fusion of those two ideas. This backlash against comic books in the 1950s led to a flurry of televised court hearings and investigations into the influence that comic books were having on the young. There was also a fair bit of classism in the response to juvenile delinquency, and this quote says, "Authorities agree that juvenile criminality is spreading. Frequently, it crosses the tracks from the wrong side to the right." Now, I read a little bit of nativism into that because it's sort of like, oh, the poorer classes can't help but be criminal and risque and lower, and they're sort of corrupting our, like, white-collar middle-class children, but that's just me. Other proposed causes were lax corporal punishment, subpar housing, and broken families. All of these things don't apply to Rhoda because her parents are still married and she is delightfully middle class, and her mother does end up spanking her in the film. This is a letter from a real American woman named Eugenia. She describes herself as an American mother and demonstrates the real fervor over comic books, and she calls them poisonous, she calls them lurid, highly colored, awful crime stories, polluting the air and corrupting the minds of the younger generations. And she definitely is blaming the juvenile delinquency epidemic on this. So this isn't, like, this was a very real response to what was happening. And it was written only a year before the original book that The Bad Seed was based on was released. Now, Rhoda is a very dramatized and amped up version of this phenomenon. She's a middle-class kid who suddenly commits senseless violence. However, the film attributes her violence to genetics, while giving her deliberately good home life and doting parents with lots of recreation and stable sources of discipline and nourishment. By absolving the parents and the home environment of guilt, the film, I feel like, is trying to assuage the fears of the audience of their culpability in the current juvenile delinquency epidemic of the time. The parents who are watching the film can comfort themselves in the idea that Rhoda was just born that way, and even the most charmed life imaginable couldn't have changed her. There was nothing they could do. It's worth noting that while the movie was received well by critics, one reviewer of the original book disagreed with the premise wholesale, saying that the daughter of a murderess is no more likely to be a murderess than the daughter of a seamstress or anyone else. So that sort of reflects the behaviorist ideals of the time that we also see in that previous letter. So now we're going to move on to what the current research has to say about nature versus nurture in the context of personality and development. So obviously research on this topic has evolved since The Bad Seed was made, and the general consensus of it is that both nature and nurture influence us in different complex ways. Steven Pinker, who was a professor at MIT, lists the 3 laws of behavioral genetics. 1. All human behavioral traits are heritable. 2. The effects of being raised in the same family is smaller than the effect of genes. And 3. A substantial portion of the variation is not accounted for by the effects of genes or family. Pinker goes on to explain how twin studies are instrumental to the understanding of these laws. Identical twins who are raised far away from each other, share all of their genes and none of their environment. And thus, one has a strong basis to suggest that cognitive similarities between them has a strong root in their DNA, especially when compared to fraternal twins, regular siblings, and adopted siblings. Adopted siblings share the same environment and none of their DNA, so they're a good contrast for this in studies of this nature. So the results of these types of studies in conjunction with others is that heritability, a measurement of similarity based in genetics, is valued from around 0.25 to 0.75. A journal article I found, co-authored by Robert McCrae and Paul Costa, whose names you might recognize because they developed the OCEAN, or 5-factor personality model, compares nearly 40 years of these types of studies and concludes that personality is built largely on the genetic foundation of temperament. And temperament is a bit of a tricky concept, but it's a biologically based psychological tendency. So if you say someone has an extroverted temperament or a conscientious temperament, it's behavior that is sort of reactive in nature. It also asserts that parenting only has a subtle effect on personality, and that people from all across different cultures can be assessed using similar breakdowns of personality traits, and that personality sort of stabilizes by the time one reaches adulthood. And also that certain personality traits become more heritable as you get older. Like your child IQ, like when you're younger, may not necessarily reflect that of your parents, but by adulthood, the heritability jumps up to like 0.8, which is kind of cool. However, while the general conclusion is that genetics predominantly determine one person's personality, the authors of all of these books, Pinker, Costa McCrae, all recognize the importance of parenthood as, not only providing nourishment and protection to children, giving them the earliest model for social interaction and emotional regulation, but also just forging a genuine human relationship with your child. So definitely parenthood is still important, just maybe not, it doesn't completely determine your kid's personality. However, genetics do not exist in a vacuum. The environment gives them the context to exist and forms their function. The environment doesn't affect genes directly. Genes are not directly affected. It is the behaviors that they code for in the context of the environment. It's their phenotype, which is the thing that we actually see. The environment dictates what traits are advantageous in what context, and the sort of entanglement between outside conditions and inside processes is on every level of life. On the smaller scale, most traits are polygenic, requiring multiple genes and ideal conditions to create the given phenotype, which means it's sort of difficult to change like something that we see with just one gene. It has to be like multiple things acting in conjunction, and sometimes that change can only happen due to like a massive shift in the environment. Genes have also been proven to respond to their environment. In one experience by Felka and Kudalova in 2001 showed that moth larvae with a genotypic mutation for short antennae still developed normal length antennae when they were incubated at a higher temperature and were able to pass this trait down to their offspring, even when their offspring were incubated at a normal temperature. So it shows that genetics are not everything when looking at the actual physical traits someone has, and that can also theoretically imply to personality. Moving on to humans, the construct of heritability has also been questioned. Heritability is only applicable to the specific group it is calculated for, and it often can be misleading as it minimizes environmental effects. For example, wearing earrings in 1950s America is extremely heritable. It's largely linked to people with a specific set of sex chromosomes, even though we know that wearing earrings is entirely behavioral and is not genetic. It's the cultural ideas around sex and gender that make it extremely heritable, because only women wore earrings in 1950s America. It's also proven that 70% of identical twins, who are often used in studies to prove the influence of genetics, share a placenta. And this means that their prenatal environment, independent of whatever genes that they have, is more similar than other types of siblings, as well as the phenomenon of unequal placenta sharing that can result in differences in their growth. Now, let's move on to discussing personality disorders and how they apply to Rhoda Penmark. So, sociopathy and psychopathy are extreme cases of antisocial personality disorder, clusters of traits that manifest in patterns of disregard for the rights of others. Rhoda Penmark is actually shockingly realistic, exhibiting all the symptoms described in a research study that I read as interpersonal affective traits. She has the superficial charm, the absence of nervousness or guilt, the pathological egocentricity, and the dishonesty. The research study goes on to state that given some data from a Minnesota twin study of 666 sets of twins, that the two major components for these types of disorders, fearless dominance and impulsive antisociability, are substantially genetic. So this sort of supports the bad seeds hypothesis that Rhoda is a sociopath because her grandmother was. He also makes this distinction between primary and secondary psychopathy. Primary sociopathy is rooted in a core lack of empathy and more influenced by genetic factors. This once again supports the bad seeds depiction of Rhoda. But how does the environment affect these types of disorders? Studies show that psychopathy occurs more in children that are abused, which Rhoda is not. But it is possible that other parts of her environment are influencing her personality disorder. In a book, The Nature of Nurture, the author said that peer relationships are an important environmental factor in the development of children, as they help develop perspective-taking, empathy, and aggression modulation. These are all things that Rhoda can't do very well because of her disorder. School is also important because it promotes sort of motivation and focus, and Rhoda is definitely motivated by her school life because she's clearly focused enough on school to be a competitor in this penmanship contest and invested enough to kill over it. All of her motives for killing are egocentric, and she only kills people she stands to gain from. She stands to gain a sort of reprieve from her wounded pride by stealing the medal from Claude. She also confesses to killing an elderly woman because she wanted a snow globe. She wants a trinket. And she kills the handyman Leroy because he threatens to expose her to the police. So all of these killings are very egocentric, and she gains something from each of them. And last but probably least, we're going to be looking at my original creative component called The Bad Seed, Twisted Roots. And it's a lighthearted parody of The Bad Seed, where we have Rhoda's father talking to Christine and telling her that she's the daughter of the serial killer, but then attributing Rhoda's behavior to her ancestors gets more and more out of hand, and it's sort of poking fun at the idea of biological determinism. I'm afraid it is, my dear. You were adopted, and your birth mother is the infamous serial killer, Bessie Daniel.
I remember. You're hiding me away when the police arrived. Oh God, my darling Rhoda!
What would Rhoda have to do with all of this? She's a perfectly lovely young girl.
Father, one of Rhoda's classmates was found at the bottom of the river after beating her penmanship contest. I'm afraid she may have inherited my mother's sociopathic genes.
I think that's highly unlikely. I mean, you and Kenneth have done such a good job of providing a delightfully middle-class environment for Rhoda. Surely life as charming as this one couldn't spawn a little murderess. She can't possibly resemble a monster she's ever met.
Father, if you know anything else about my birth family, you must tell me.
Well, I remember when Danica was in the news for her crimes, they mentioned her upbringing on this rural farm somewhere out nowhere. She spent all of her time making hay bales.
Oh. Father, look! Rhoda's out in the yard stacking up leaves. It was that old family farm I hazily remembered. That tacky wallpaper, fleur-de-lis everywhere I hid.
As I do recall, the orphanage said your family was French in origin.
Wait a second. I'd always wondered where Rhoda had picked up her smoking habit and taste for existential literature.
Last time, at the neon at the 11th of July, so the 13th. I love 2 hours. Homo.
And what about her mild stutter?
When are you going to learn how to read?
Your maternal grandfather had an awful speech impediment.
Or her nut-tying skills?
Many of the Danker men served in the Navy during World War I.
Or even her penchant for wistful gazes?
Well, that's just because you read too many romance novels as a girl, my dear.
This is getting out of hand. I firmly believe that Rhoda's disposition and psychological abnormalities are genetic. But all these minute behaviors?
Yeah.
Surely her own personal experiences in this world have shaped her more than her DNA, or Kenneth and I. Maybe her privilege and childlike ego made her predisposition for sociopathic tendencies surface. Maybe Kenneth's absence during the military made her rely on external validation and trinkets for affection, causing her to value them more than human life.
Or it all goes back to Rhoda's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, Maria Teresa Fontina della Medici. She killed more peasant girls than Countess Tabacri in her bloodiest nightmares.
Oh, sure. That.
In conclusion, psychology is rarely black or white. It's all shades of gray matter. Nature and nurture are both extremely important to the development of the human psyche, and they both have their time to shine in separate venues. This debate has been a hot topic for so long because it's trying to determine what defines our personhood, what makes us who we are. Answering that question simply, although proven impossible with recent research, would make understanding ourselves and others so much easier. In the 1950s, people were trying to understand why the youth of their time were becoming so violent. Some blamed comic books, some blamed poor housing, and some wrote wildly popular fiction about sociopathic little girls to express a shared cultural anxiety that nothing could be done about it. In short, The Bad Seed is a time capsule that captures how the United States was confronting a social problem with psychological concepts, but our understanding of those concepts has refined in the ensuing 64 years. These are my sources. Thank you so much for watching this.